Welcome back to the Hamilton Education Law Program. My name is Alex Baddick, and today we're going to be talking about student discipline. Now, when it comes to student discipline, there's a couple of different concepts that we really want to understand. So we're going to divide it into two different workshops. The first workshop that we're going to be doing is just to get you to understand a broad little overview on the topic of student discipline and what that really entails. And we'll be focusing on suspensions. I have a picture here of all these different cartoon characters to kind of illustrate a really common theme in a lot of TV shows, but really a common theme across the board when it comes to school. And it's this idea of ensuring that students are following the rules, being compliant with the rule book, the codes of conduct, the things that one would expect school children to follow. So in some of these circumstances, whether it be The Simpsons or Hey Arnold and Disney's Fillmore, that's a big throwback. I don't know if any of you have ever seen something like that. But what you'll see with some of these characters when they engage in school is that sometimes they break the rules, or sometimes other students break the rules and they're involved in it. Typically, it's the case that those students may face some sort of consequence in those episodes or in their school environments. And that's kind of what I'm really trying to talk about today. What happens in real life in Ontario, in Hamilton, when it comes to codes of conduct, rules being broken, and just this general expectation of what your responsibilities are and what you owe to the school in terms of your behaviors. And then what are the obligations of the school board for dealing with matters related to student behavior? And that's really at the heart of what our discussion is about today, the responsibilities of a school and at school. So when we think about student discipline, we can't separate it from the idea of the code of conduct. And I'll give you a moment to think about what a code of conduct is, but it is essentially a set of rules, right? It's things that you're expected to follow to make sure and ensure that all students are safe at school, there's order and discipline in the school. But it doesn't necessarily have to extend only to school property, only to hours within school time. And the Education Act, which we rely on, if you remember from understanding Ontario's education system, is that the code of conduct allows for behaviors and codes of conduct sometimes kind of transpiring past school hours, past school time, physically, the location of the school. Things don't necessarily have to happen within those contexts of school. Sometimes it can be the case that an event outside of school time and school property has an impact on the school climate. And the code of conduct essentially says if there is an impact of on the school climate, then it may be something that the school might have jurisdiction to discipline. And again, this is relating back to our topic of student discipline. So the code of conduct will outline what it is that students can and cannot do, mostly can't do. So the way they kind of resolve that and the way that they ensure students are disciplined if they're doing something contrary to the code of conduct or the Education Act is through a suspension. And for those unfamiliar with suspensions, these are typically between 1 to 20 days. Now, you may be familiar with the term in-school suspension. It's not necessarily, it is not the same concept as a suspension. An in-school suspension is where you are still in school and where it doesn't necessarily align with the legislative definitions of what a suspension would be. A suspension, for the purposes of what we're discussing, is something that's contrary to the code of conduct. It affects your student record, and it's where you're removed from school for a certain amount of time. So that's what a suspension is. But there are different kinds of suspensions. And I mentioned in-school suspension, but those aren't the types of suspensions I'm referring to. In fact, the idea of an in-school suspension is something called, it's more related to something called progressive discipline that we'll talk about a bit later. When I'm talking about suspensions, I'm talking about the types of suspensions that are required when a student does something contrary to the Education Act or the code of conduct. There are two types of suspensions, like I mentioned. The first is a discretionary suspension. And this is essentially when a principal must consider giving a suspension. The key word here is consider. It's discretionary. It allows them to decide whether or not a suspension will be necessary in the given circumstances. And the Education Act permits discretionary suspensions in these following circumstances: when there is a threat or serious harm to another student, if there's an involvement of alcohol or illegal drugs, or students being under the influence, swearing at a teacher, principal, or another person, vandalizing property, bullying, or other activities in the board's code of conduct as well. Now, this isn't as an exhaustive list. There are certainly behaviors that may warrant suspensions, but the key to this concept is remembering that discretionary suspensions allows principals to use their judgment to determine whether or not a suspension will be valid in that given instance. The alternative to that then is a non-discretionary suspension. And the Education Act actually requires a student to be suspended in specific circumstances only after an investigation validates the circumstances that occurred. So some of the items that require a suspension include where weapons, or including a firearm, are used, where a weapon is used to threaten or harm another student, if the physical hurt another person experiences requires medical attention, sexual assaults, and trafficking of weapons or illegal drugs. Now, again, this isn't an exhaustive list of items, but the point here is that there are elements in the Education Act or in the Code of Conduct that permit school boards to, without any discretion, and in fact require them to suspend a student. And the distinction is very important for advocacy efforts for sure. So we're just gonna do a brief set of activities, and I'm gonna get you to pause as we go through each of them and think about what would you do in these circumstances and what would you kind of decide. So we've got a high school student who is, he or she or they show up to lunch disoriented. They're shouting loud words. He smells marijuana, he smells like marijuana, and has a beer can open in his hands. Now, in this circumstance, would there be a discretionary opportunity for a principal or a non-discretionary opportunity for a principal to implement a suspension? And I'll give you one moment to consider that and then give your answer. You can pause here. Okay, so the answer to that would likely be a discretionary suspension if we're really aligning or understanding to what we just mentioned previously about what falls within discretionary grounds. And within that circumstance, discretionary, it includes things like bringing alcohol or illegal substances to school. There can be many different reasons for why that circumstance is unfolded. Some of the reasons may not necessarily warrant a disciplinary measure. There might be other resources that may be more effective in managing that circumstance. For example, the student may have a lot of psychological harm that they're trying to quell as a result of in an effort to kind of mitigate the harm mentally, emotionally that they're going through. So these are things that a principal would want to consider when deciding whether or not they wanted to suspend a student. So the Education Act allows them to make that discretionary judgment. Now, Timmy is spray painting the side of the school after hours. When his teacher heads out to confront Timmy, he explains that he has been hired to do a mural by the school principal. So in this circumstance, I'm going to let you take a moment to decide whether or not this was as well discriminatory or discretionary or non-discretionary. I'll give you a moment. Okay, so in this circumstance, and we have to really read the whole paragraph to get a full understanding of what the decision would be. What we know here is that Timmy is spray painting the side of the school, which would typically be considered vandalism, which under the Education Act would allow for a principal to provide a suspension. However, we understand that the student was actually given permission to do that by a principal. So what we know is that if the student was given permission to do that, then a suspension is unlikely to be given in this circumstance. But what's the important idea to take away from this is, again, that if it was an act of vandalism, this would still be a discretionary event to make note of for principals to follow. And this is, again, is important for advocacy efforts. You want to know what a principal has within their jurisdiction to change their mind on. And some things that we've discussed so far allude to that. Finally, two young girls are arguing at the front of the school before classes begin in the morning. Both girls hit and kick each other to the point where both need medical attention after teachers intervene. Now, this one's a little bit more substantive, and I'll give you a few moments to think about this one before we take it up. Okay, so this one is a little bit deeper. It gives you quite a bit of information that you've got to work with. So we know that there's a fight going on at the front of the school, and we know that both people hit each other, and we know that medical attention is required. So what we're taking from here is, and the most important part is the medical attention being necessary. Now, the discretion is afforded to principals if a fight occurs. However, the non-discretionary components of the Education Act for suspensions tend to require require suspension once medical intervention is necessary. From that, we can kind of identify this being a circumstance in which a suspension would then be mandatory. So that's important to kind of make the distinctions, because if a student has caused harm, require medical attention, we want to know if a principal, after conducting a thorough investigation, has fulfilled their obligations conferred on them by the Education Act, which would require them to suspend a student as a result. But we'd also want to know that even if we're the parents of a student who is the alleged offender in the circumstances, because it also gives us an understanding of what the powers are and what the school is able to do and if they're required to do it. So if it were the case that medical intervention was not necessary, we would know that the school did have the flexibility to give their discretion in the circumstances. Now, we're going to do a couple more, and we're about to wrap up, but this one's a little bit more lengthy. Mohammed is having a rough day. He just found out that he failed a math test and is under a lot of pressure to pass his science test tomorrow. He skips English class to study, but is told by the principal he has a detention for skipping. Frustrated, Mohammed swears and threatens to kill the principal. Now, this is a very interesting circumstance. It seems to be a bit of an escalation from some of the other matters that we've seen. And yet, do we still see the discretion being afforded to Mohammed in this circumstance for a suspension? Well, what we know here is that he has skipped class and he has sworn at the principal, but he also threatens to kill the principal. Now, we don't know what it is in the Education Act that requires discretion to be, when it says threats in discretion, we don't know what the kind of parameters are for that. Threats occur in different levels for sure. Now, if a threat is a little bit more legitimate, a threat is a little bit more egregious, there may be an argument that it might be a mandatory, not necessarily mandatory, but the discretion would err on the side of needing a suspension. But the point is, and I really want to hit this across to everyone, the point is that discretion affords a principal the opportunity to not discipline a student. Now, that doesn't mean in every circumstance that they will not give that discretion, but the point is that it allows for a form of advocacy. So even if the principal found that swearing and threatening to kill would require a suspension, the Education Act actually says that threats can be discretionary. And that means that the principal must consider other factors in making their decision. So with that said, we're going to also touch on what some of those factors would be later on in the next segment of this discussion. But when it comes to expulsions, which are kind of the second half of student discipline, there's student suspensions and then there's student expulsions. Now, non-discretionary investigations are required before a recommendation for an expulsion. And that means that if you have been giving a mandatory suspension, or if you've been given a suspension for up to 20 days, you are still required to be under investigation, and the principal must ensure that they've gathered all the facts and all that kind of stuff. But in making a determination to expel a student, it's especially important that an investigation is conducted, a thorough investigation that has determined whether or not a student can be permitted in that school again. When it comes to expulsions, though, there are two kinds. There are school-only expulsions and then school and school board expulsions. The distinction between the two is you're not permitted in this school at the school board versus you're not permitted at any school at the school board. And you can see why there might be an escalation from the two. Some behaviors may require a lot more, a higher degree of discipline is in the opinion of the Education Act. So that's why there's that distinction. Some behaviors are treated a lot more serious than others. So when we talk about the school-only expulsions, it means you cannot go to school or participate in any related activities at the school. You're suspended first and then recommended to be expelled. For school board expulsions, it's a recommendation to be expelled from the school board entirely. So I'm just going to wrap up now. When it comes to student discipline, looking at student suspensions and expulsions, they are very significant. And they're significant for many different reasons, particularly because it's recorded on your Ontario student record. Now, that's significant because it's going to be viewable for other teachers and other administrators. And what we know about sociological research when it comes to student discipline is that this might allow for the conscious or unconscious biases as a result of having that information available to you. So if a teacher is aware of your past behaviors or past discipline, they may form an impression that you would prefer them not to have. And in fact, it might paint a picture for them going forward into the future about how they view other behaviors that you might demonstrate. But not only is it significant in that regard, it's also significant because it also creates an argument for why you should be disciplined again in the future. Having one suspension or expulsion on your record kind of starts to build a case that you are deserving of further student discipline, which might not necessarily be true at all. But it allows, and especially when we get into progressive discipline, you'll see how that applies, but it allows for schools and administrators to make decisions about student discipline a lot easier against you if they choose to punish you or your child. And finally, you are removed from school or permanently moved, it impacts your education. So just the idea of being removed and out of school has a very tangible impact on your educational outcomes. Research actually tells us that there is a number, like a palpable, tangible number of missed days from school that decrease the likelihood of graduating. So when it comes to student discipline, this idea of having students out of school, it's something that we want to challenge whenever it pops up because it decreases likelihood for success. And we know that because of research. But we also know that it also provides schools with a lot more opportunities to not allow for educational progress and success. So that's it for this workshop on student discipline. We looked at suspensions and expulsions. In the next workshop, what we're going to look at are mitigating factors in progressive discipline. We know that discretionary and non-discretionary suspensions are available. So when it comes to issues of discretion, we want to consider what are these things that teachers or administrators and principals are looking at when it comes to making decisions like that. So thanks for tuning into this this workshop for student suspensions and expulsions as a part of student discipline. And we'll join us next time for student discipline when it comes to progressive discipline and mitigating factors. Thank you.